Hello, everyone. Welcome to the History Valley YouTube channel with your host, Jacob Berman. Tonight, I am joined once again by Sylvester Holt and again by author James Stevens Valliant. Today, we're doing a response against Israel Only, headed by Jason DeCosta. Jason DeCosta uploads many videos on Israel Only, and this is one of them right here, titled, "You Will Sit on 12 Thrones, Judging the 12 Tribes, Luke 22, Israel Only, Full Preterism." So let's dive right into it. We may have someone else joining us during the recording.
Call me when you want, call me when you need, call me on my own name, I'll be on the way,
Well, hello everybody and welcome to my show. My name is Jason DeCosta and that was Little Nas X with Montero coming straight at you from the car radio. And we're just doing a bit of cruising, holding off on the boozing. And I wanted to make a little offering for you regarding Luke chapter 22.
Here we go.
Verses 28 and 29, I believe it is. And the question was posed, or the comment was made by a man named Dustin. And Dustin's been a follower of my channel for a while now. And he asked this question the other day and said, or suggested that I make a video on this because it would back up IO nicely. And he's absolutely right. It does back up IO very nicely. I've talked about it a lot in videos. I can't remember if I've done anything recently, but this is one of the best proof texts right out of the mouth of Jesus, actually.
Wow.
And it basically shows the whole kingdom deliverance. It shows the whole identity of those in the kingdom.
Oh my goodness.
And it just wraps it all up in a nice nutshell for you.
We'll get right
puts
to
a
it,
little
Jason.
bow on it. So it's Luke chapter 22, verse 28. Jesus says this to the disciples. He says, "But you are those who have continued with me in my trials. And I bestow upon you a kingdom just as my Father bestowed one upon me, that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom and sit on thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." So Jesus makes a very interesting statement here, talking about the disciples being those who have continued with him through his trials. And when I think about that, I think about, like Peter in Acts, I think it was, saying through much tribulation, we must enter, or we will enter the kingdom of God. Well, we'll get back to that in a minute.
So I feel like pausing right there. I'm trying to find something here while I do. You want to start us off, Valliant, with a response?
Well, I mean, this is a flat non sequitur, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It's not quite clear about what he's saying yet that he's proving from this, but presumably what he's going to suggest is that since the disciples are all accounting for only the 12 tribes, we've accounted for the entire redemptive project of Jesus. That the redemptive project of Jesus extends no further than the 12 tribes of Israel, that no Gentiles are meant to be included, and his evidence here is that Jesus says that the disciples will themselves sit on 12 thrones and judge the 12 tribes. That is simply a non sequitur, obviously. On the face of it, it's a non sequitur. There's not much more to say. Now, there's certainly a relationship between the fact that there's 12 tribes of Israel and the fact that Jesus has 12 disciples. But let me suggest that the causal priority there isn't so automatic. For example, we know that the leadership in the Dead Sea Scrolls sectarian, amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls sectarians, was a leadership group of 12. And so there are probably more proximate historical causes for there being 12 disciples than the giant apocalyptic one stated here. It's obviously a statement about the redemptive project. That's true too.
Right.
On the face of it, one day they get a kingdom of their own. But that's it. They get a kingdom of their own. They don't get the universe. And
Right.
the kingdom they get is the kingdom they belong to. To contrast it, for example, with the centurion in Matthew.
Right.
Matthew says the centurion has greater faith than anyone in Israel. And then he goes on to have a big speech about how many in Israel, among the Jews, there'll be great national misery, but many nations will come and sit at the table with Abraham, he says in Matthew.
Right.
And so this does not close us down from there being other judges of other nations or the redemptive project being wider than the 12 tribes of Israel.
Yeah.
That's just
Here we go. In Luke 9, it says when it brings up Jesus sends out the 12 apostles. He gave them the power and authority over all demons and to cure diseases, and he sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal. And he said to them, "Take nothing for your journey, no staff, nor bag, nor bread, nor money, and do not have 2 tunics. And whatever house you enter, stay there, and from there depart. And whatever they do not receive you." Excuse me, it says, "And wherever they do not receive you, when you leave that town, shake off the dust from your feet as a testimony against them."
right. The famous
And
charge Jesus did
they
himself.
departed and went through the villages, preaching the gospel and healing everywhere. Look, everywhere. That's what I was looking for. So, I mean, I don't really know how everywhere is Israel only, because it's everywhere.
Right.
No
Well,
exceptions.
everywhere in the region, at least. And there are certain at the time certainly loaded with all kinds of non-Jews. Yeah. No question, the concentration of population in Judea, and
Right.
the majority, even in Galilee, were at the time Jewish. Obviously, you have significant populations all the way up to
Mm-hmm.
Antioch and Damascus.
Yeah.
Yeah. Significant Jewish population, of course, existed throughout the Eastern Roman Empire, Alexandria, and presumably across the Aegean.
John, you got any comments?
Yeah, I mean, my biggest problem is he's quoting Jesus, and the unknown authors of Luke were so far removed. All we can do is guess that it's even close. But this isn't Jesus saying anything. It's the author of Luke who's writing to a Gentile audience.
Yeah.
It had nothing to do. This was not directed at Jews in any
Right.
way. And the rhetorical prose that the author wrote in was exaggerating everything. And to me, our host that we're debating is a very intelligent guy, but to me, he's also very apologetic in his interpretation of the text. And to me, it's a non-starter from that perspective. It goes outside the lines of academia and what we know historically speaking.
I have to agree with that.
Yeah.
It goes well outside the lines of what we know historically. And the style it's as though they learned their style of reasoning from apologetics, not from critical scholarship at all. It is not to be even, I have to agree entirely. It's not in line with any kind of critical scholarship of the last
Right.
180 years I'm aware of. And
Right.
also, it flies in the face of basic historic fact.
Right.
The assumption that somehow these lost tribes of Israel are still active and are identifiable, and we know who they are, and it's really kind of silly.
Well, I believe he's somebody that believes in that Abraham existed, and Abraham will never have historicity as far as that goes. And I think even trying to posit that the 12 tribes were real, to me, it just seems like a 5th and 6th century creation at that point, as far as what we know. Anyway, please carry on.
All right. Sylvester, you have any comments?
Not at the moment, no.
All right.
I
I'm
don't.
going to continue.
Also, we see in places like Matthew 24 where Jesus talks about, the great tribulation of those last days, and so Jesus is saying, you are those who have continued with me in my trials. He's speaking to the disciples, and he says, and I will bestow upon you a kingdom, just as my Father bestowed one upon me. Now, the kingdom there, right? Who is the kingdom? Well, I usually like to look at Luke chapter 1. I think it's verses 30 to 33. Gosh, let's see. Let's try to get over there. Hold on. Bear with me one moment, folks. Luckily, I'm kind of stuck in traffic right now, so I can pull this off. Let's take a Ganderewski here. KJV is the first one that popped up, so that's what we're going to click on. And it's Luke chapter 1, verses roughly 31, I think. Yeah, 31. It says, and behold, you shall conceive in thy womb, and bring forth a son, and shall call his name Jesus. Okay, and then he goes on, he says, he shall be great, and shall be called the Son of the Highest, and the Lord God shall give unto him the throne of his father David. So, first of all, who did David, right? It's using King David as sort of a comparison to Jesus and what his throne would be. But the question I always like to ask people is, who did King David rule over? Did King David rule over the entire world, or was he ruling over the kingdom of Israel? I think you know the answer. And so that's just something to take notice of here, as it talks about Jesus being given the throne of his father David, right? It's interesting that it says his father, right? The descendant argument, right? Was that spiritual? Was Jesus the spiritual descendant of King David? No. And then we go on, and here's the key. Verse 33, it says, and he, speaking of Jesus, shall reign over the house of Israel forever, and of his kingdom there shall be no end. Okay, so those are equivalent statements. He shall reign over the house of Israel forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end. It's basically telling you that the house of Israel is his kingdom. That's what it's telling you. I'll read it again. Pick up on it. And he shall reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end. So you see how if you read it in the proper tone and in the proper flow.
Go ahead.
Yeah, you can read it as many times as he likes. But there's several ways of looking at this. Luke is clearly aware of the Pauline Revolution. The Gospels certainly have their differences, but they are aware of the basic Pauline Revolution, all of them. I mean, Matthew clearly is more strict about the law. Luke is clearly more Gentile-oriented. But one thing that all the Gospels have in common is an appreciation of the basic Pauline Revolution of the house of uncircumcised Gentiles into the house of Israel. Full stop. I know that's one of the basic points that Israel only disputes, but Paul devotes a good deal of his attention to to his Torah criticism, to the fact that circumcision is no longer necessary, and it doesn't matter whether you're a Jew or a Greek, an outsider, insider,
Right.
you are male, female, Jew, Greek, doesn't matter. You can be adopted into the house of Israel thanks to the redemptive death of Christ Jesus, as Paul sees it. So if Israel only doesn't see it that way, if they think that Paul's, and Jesus' mission is limited in this way, then they're not going to understand even the scope of Israel in Christian literature. Admission to Israel is not as restrictive as it was before Paul, and if they don't confront that simple reality, all of this will continue to be confusion. Because even the Gospels, it's obvious that Jesus' mission is eventually even in Matthew, eventually Jesus' mission will be to all the nations at the end of Matthew, even though initially it's restricted just to Jews.
Yeah, and Jason's trying to say, what it really means is to all the lost sheep in all the nations, which is not what it says.
That is not what it says.
Right.
No, he's taken a literal interpretation, and what he misses out on the social anthropology of this time period was that Judaism welcomed everybody. That's why Herod built the court. He was a Hellenist. He built it for diaspora Gentiles to come in. And one thing about Judaism, all of Judaism, even today, they welcome outsiders into Passovers. It's not something that they keep mutually exclusive. You look at one of their tenets, it's just don't eat the sacrifice meat. But other than that, you're welcome to eat the unleavened bread. You're welcome to come in. Judaism was open for all. And you had Judaism was not one culture in the Israelite religion. It's not even really right to call it Judaism per se because of all the multiple cultures that were following this. And your largest sects were the oppressed peasants. And then other than that, it was basically your Hellenist oppressors, which was Herod, the residents of Tiberias, Sepphoris, Caesarea, all Hellenists that were running this and keeping the peasant population oppressed. And when we get to Luke, Luke is selling, again, he's selling this to the Gentiles, trying to create a better deity than the Son of God that the emperor currently was. So he's selling the Son of God aspect to him. He's selling a better king than King Herod. He's selling a new king. He's selling a better Messiah than that, and he's using David to build authority in his message, so that because most of these proselytes and these Hellenists in the diaspora were well versed in this Israelite religion, and he's speaking directly to them and people that have a basic knowledge to this, but he also goes into details, and he knows that a large percentage of his audience again are the Gentiles, and that's who his main target is, that he's selling it. Because there's a lot of divorcing cultural Judaism going on in Luke's text, which kind of blows the IO theory completely to me out of the water. It's again non sequitur. Go ahead.
Romans 16:11 by itself also destroys Israel only. And just any link to any of that, or even Herodian involvement in the Pauline text or in Paul's mission by itself compromises Israel only. It's so easy for it to fall apart with just one verse, and it just collapses like some ridiculous some other ridiculous theories that's been discussed recently.
Well, if this was Israel only, then how come we have zero text coming from Israel out of the whole New Testament? There's absolutely nothing. There's complete silence from the so-called Jerusalem sect or the Aramaic followers. We're lucky to even guess that we have some material going back to the Galilean ministry, and all we can do is keep our fingers crossed that it does. And even at our best, we still can't tell if a parable originated with John or Jesus.
No, we can't tell if a parable originated with Jesus. And many of the parables appear to be, let me put it this way, directed at a missionary type thinking.
They're Hellenistic texts, regardless. And I want them to have a tie, but you can't make it yet. I mean, yet there's some of the poor stuff and some of the peasant stuff. It mirrors what a Galilean would think, and all we can do is hope that the Hellenists that were at these Passovers after crucifixion picked up on some of the real reports from the real ministry. But it's vague at best because the texts are all Hellenistic and far removed from his ministry, especially Luke, who uses an extreme prose that's really he's putting so much, I don't want to say myth and fiction in, but he's trying to keep you so excited that you keep turning the page, and his exaggerations are pretty deep.
Right.
Yes. Well, and he's obviously provided so much of the narrative structure for the sayings that we know existed in a clumped form in Matthew. And as you say, this is in Greek. It's even difficult to find Aramaic and Hebrew equivalences. There are certain ideas which appear to go back to, I can only imagine, rural Jewish, Orthodox, even rebel sentiment. I mean, it's something as straightforward as the focus on the poor. something like "Blessed are the poor" or something, probably is talking to your disaffected Jewish peasant who was so easy to be attracted to messianic rebel. Or in Matthew, the line about dogs, Gentiles, that probably is the kind of xenophobic Jewish nationalism that we see among rebels, not typically in the New Testament, which of course typically stands on its head to say just the opposite.
Right.
Even in Matthew, it's taking that dogs, the Canaanite woman in the dogs line, and he's helping the Canaanite woman against the disciples' advice. Even that is being transformed. So yeah, we're not looking at something that rural Jews in Galilee came up with. No. This is sophisticated, Hellenized Jewish writers who are very familiar with Judaism of the time and Hebrew literature, obviously, who are behind the Gospels. The idea that we're talking about actual lost sheep of Israel out there is just even historically bizarre.
Right. Now, what Jason will say is he doesn't care if the story is historical or not. He says it's within the story. It is Israel only. That's what he'll say to that. He doesn't care about the history.
Within the story, it is simply on its four corners not.
Right.
I mean, anyone can read the text literally, but that's not how any historian or scholar works as far as the text. Even the commentaries that are, I don't want to call them apologetic in nature, but even the commentaries will go against what he's trying to present to his audiences.
Well, all you have to do is look at some of the language that's so open-ended. The most famous section, maybe of the Gospels, certainly the most quoted these days, John 3:16. Whosoever believes. I mean, so open-ended. And it doesn't there limit anything. Or in Galatians, when it says there's no difference between Greek and Jew, male and female, slave or free. It goes that abstract. It backs up to the level of male, female, free, slave, Jew, Greek.
It doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't say. Right. It's not like it says. It's not like it says, whoever is a lost sheep that believes in Jesus shall be saved. It says whosoever believes in Jesus shall be saved.
That's right. Yeah. There are times like that where, like Paul in Galatians, when he goes out to male, female, slave, free, Greek, Jew.
And it's so hilarious because
he's meaning to include everybody. It's clear intent. I think the same is true in John. The same is also true in places in Matthew and Luke. It's clear that the message of salvation, just taken on its literal four corners, is for everybody. So that when Jesus does praise a centurion, as he does in Matthew, we're not told that the centurion is what his ethnic background or religious background is. He's presumably an outsider, a foreigner, and Jesus says he has more faith than anyone in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Point blank, end of story.
Keeping the proper context in mind, you can see that this is all about the restoration of Israel, and they are the kingdom, right? When we think about, what did Paul say in 1 Corinthians 15? He said, what's the order of the resurrections? He said, Christ the first fruits, then those who are Christ at his coming, then comes the end, when he will deliver the kingdom and hand over the kingdom to God the Father, right? That's basically what it says. So again, who's the kingdom that Christ is handing over at his coming? It's the house of Israel. It's the house of Jacob. That's what Luke 1 clearly says. And so let's take a bouncerooski back over to Luke chapter 22 and check out verse 29 again. And I bestow upon you a kingdom, that's the house of Israel, of course, just as my Father bestowed one upon me, that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom. Okay, that's obviously wedding feast language. We know that's peppered throughout the pages. And we know that.
Yeah.
Hey, I just wanted to touch base really quick on the kingdom of God. Does anybody here in this group know of a single definition that sticks that everybody runs with. As far as I was concerned,
Right.
it's heavily debated in context, and to me, it takes a lot of arrogance for him to come up with the ultimate one solution to cover multiple books that are actually selling different types of kingdoms of God.
Well, for
so I
God's
just wanted to
sake.
throw that in there. I couldn't let it sit.
What a brilliant point that is, because the texts that we even have, the canonical texts of the New Testament, are arguing with each other and themselves over what exactly we mean by that. Is the kingdom already here? Right? I mean, there's one theory. What do we mean by the kingdom? So yeah, that is such an outstanding point. The texts themselves are wrestling with the meaning of the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God.
Absolutely. I don't even want to step on trying to pick a side one way or the other as what was predominantly sold. I just understand that there's differences, and I sure as heck don't have. I've got some knowledge, but I don't have enough to sit there and nail that down in the theological context like the authors are doing, or assume that I know as much as the authors do.
Yeah, in 1 Corinthians 15:45. I mean,
what I can tell, there's just different views of what the kingdom of heaven exactly is, all being presented. At least 2 or 3 that I can clearly identify that are being presented, which has left modern theologians in the position of what the heck are they really talking about?
There you go.
That's a serious problem. They appear to have some easy answer that I'm not aware of. You're absolutely right. It's not so simple as they present here, and that's sort of insulting to my intelligence in a way. It is a complex problem, and they don't even indicate that it's a complex problem. So,
right.
That hurt their credibility, in my view. Yes, outstanding point, sir.
And 1 Corinthians 1:15-45 is calling Jesus the last Adam, and Adam is supposedly the father of everybody. Like, okay, why would you call Jesus the last Adam?
Because a lot of people were looking up to him, and like I said, they're rebuilding. Matthew makes a new Moses. Luke's got many other parallels to the emperor and all these other high status people, and they have to use these names because they're trying to outsell the forefathers. They're outselling Judaism. They're trying to create a new one that shines brighter and has they're trying to make it appeal more to everybody in their audience. Again, it's not just Gentiles, but it is Jews and it is proselytes. So,
and Paul in Galatians saying that the circumcised cannot be saved is a total backflip on the Jewish law.
Right.
Yeah.
There's many Jewish laws he's backflipped on.
Yeah. At the basketball court.
Even when the prophet Hosea says that the 10 lost tribes will be regathered one day, he's not envisioning a Pauline revolution about the law. Hosea believes just the opposite. People are going to come back to Torah. They're going to get their fundamentalist Jewish thing on when this regathering, this mythical regathering, happens in Hosea's prophecy. So for Israel only to suggest, as they do, that Paul is somehow simply calling for the fulfillment of Hosea, Paul is calling for a flat violation of everything Hosea had imagined in his prophecy. No question about that as well. Yeah, and another good point, sir, that you make. No question about it. They're really not grasping Paul at a basic level. Israel-only people. They're flying in the face of what Paul is actually doing and interpreting him upside down instead of opening the gates to the proselytes, which is exactly
that's absolutely true. And
Paul's main audience.
He's a Hellenistic Jew,
right?
And he's teaching to Hellenistic Jews and Gentiles, and Christianity is Hellenistic Judaism light in context.
That's
and
it.
There was no orthodoxy. It was the Hellenists were calling each other Jews simply for swearing off a pagan deity, and that's according to the Jewish Encyclopedia, that they would be called Jews by the Hellenists simply for swearing off pagan deities. They didn't have to go through all the customs, the laws, or anything. So the term Jew on its face is almost not even applicable in a academic setting, because you have to differentiate between Aramaic Jew, Hellenistic Jew, diaspora Jew. There's so much to it, and without identifying what you're working with, you're reading the text literal, and you're literally blind while doing so.
See, they don't believe, Israel only doesn't believe that there was Jewish proselytism at the time. They really deny it. Now, there may have been, the only way we can put it is racist or xenophobic groups of Jews, and I think that the sectarian documents of the scrolls indicate that to some degree. On the other hand, we also know from Josephus and other sources that there were people converted into Judaism at the time. Hebrew texts, of course, allow conversion in both the Torah. Well, what was Jonah doing when he was going to Nineveh, but talking to non-Jews? What was Ruth, but a Moabite who's being converted into Judaism? So not just in Hebrew texts.
Everybody, excuse me, James, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, no.
Herod built that temple, and he opened it up to the whole Roman Empire. And what people don't realize is that Jerusalem had anywhere from 100 to 120,000 people, which of those were probably half Hellenistic Jews and then oppressed Jews combined, due to the influx of people like in Sepphoris that went from that was destroyed at the turn of the century, that went up to 10, 20,000 people in its heyday. But that was a Hellenistic city like Tiberias and Caesarea. And when they're talking about the Gentiles that came into Passover, E.P. Sanders says 300,000 to 400,000 pilgrims a year. When we look at Josephus's numbers, he's talking about 1 million too were trapped in the temple during the war.
Right.
So these are outside Jews, Gentiles. I mean, the largest court in the temple is the court of the Gentiles. They opened this up. They made it to bring in the foreign dollars. He didn't create this, the most splendorous temple and building in the world at that time, to make money from oppressed peasants that had already been built by the Romans of taxes. He built it to bring in foreign dollars. There's stories of camel trains full of treasure and everything for the king and the other kings bringing gifts in. This was like, it's equivalent to a modern day rock concert, but 10 times the size.
Yeah.
People kind of forget of the amount of pilgrims that came into this event.
Israel only doesn't really recognize the fact that there was Jewish proselytes and missionary activity, nor do they recognize that there was a category of Hellenized Jews who read Greek, who spoke Greek, and lived in the Greek, Hellenized world of, say, Alexandria or the Aegean or Asia Minor or Rome. And so this idea of Hellenized Greeks is sort of an alien one to Israel only, but the idea of proselytes is simply impossible to get their head around. So they don't admit it.
Debate, though. That's what
we're talking about, sir. To them, it's just Jews and everybody else. And either you're one of these lost tribes, one of these lost sheep, or you're nothing. There's no proselytes. There's no Hellenists. Those gradations are not something they register.
Right.
Sorry, I know it's
is the bride, right? They're always the bride. In the Old Testament, look at Hosea. God divorces the bride, but he talks about remarrying a new bride. And when we see this new bride in the end, prepared for God, adorned and all that, it's obviously about Israel. And then verse 30, it says, we just read that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom. But here's the kicker. He finishes it off, Jesus does, by saying this, and sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So it's interesting that the disciples are being told that in the kingdom that they're going to be given, they're going to be judging the 12 tribes of Israel, right? There's no mention of any other peoples in view. There's no mention of all the nations. There's no mention of all the world. There's no mention of, endless gospel missions. No, it's just, you will sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel, right? It's pretty ideal, right? I mean, it doesn't give you much of an insight as to what that actually looks like or what that means, which is another reason why I think this is just someone's creative story made up. But yeah, so That's all it was about. It was about the 12 tribes of Israel. In the age to come, they would sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel.
Yeah, stop
That's
there.
what Matthew...
There's a great point that was made earlier. I just have to say that we're all pretty much agreed that most of what the Gospels quote as Jesus is having said could not go back to a historical Jesus. Now, and they seem to be conceding that here. He seems to be saying, oh, it's just a story. But if it's just a story, which might have been written well after the fact and words put into Jesus's mouth decades after the fact, then how does it serve him as evidence that this was Jesus's original message?
It can't, because there weren't 12 tribes in the first century to be worshipped, period. Exactly. I mean, there wasn't 12 individual tribes at this time, and it was they were obviously plagiarizing the Old Testament text to help sell, the divinity of Jesus and the authority of Jesus using the 12 tribes. And it just, they brought in all the good parts, they cherry picked and plagiarized the Old Testament for what it is, but why he's using it, but then saying it's just a story. So he seems to be cherry picking text worse than we do. At least I would say we're semi-analytical about what we would consider historical and not, instead of just willy-nilly throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Right.
Yeah.
I think Matthew's account says, Matthew 19, Jesus said to them, truly I tell you, in the renewal of all things, I must be reading a weird translation there. I think it says in the age to come, or in the regeneration, or the resurrection. Actually, yeah, it says in the resurrection. Truly I say to you that in the resurrection, the Son of Man, when the Son of Man sits on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So again, speaking to the 12 apostles, he's saying, hey, in the regeneration, which is the resurrection, in the age to come, that's the resurrection, the age to come, same thing. When the Son of Man sits on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones. Those are the 12 apostles. Of course, one representing each of the 12 tribes. And then he says, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So, pretty crystal clear stuff here, people. Pretty crystal clear stuff. Right?
I've got to.
What about 2 Timothy? If we endure, we will also reign with...
All right, comments?
Again, the 12 tribes, I can't get over it, because it's just not a tenable thing. And the reason I say that is the Gospels go a long way to trash the real apostles, and yet they're using it in rhetorical prose to build value with the 12 thrones, that they plagiarized from the Old Testament text. But on the other side of the coin, Luke, there's a ton of anti-Semitism in Luke and Matthew,
Right.
and they're definitely trashing the real apostles as not understanding Jesus' real message.
Of course, the disciples are dolts. You guys don't get it, because the first will be last and the last will be first. You guys got it. You guys just aren't getting it. Peter denies him 3 times. Judas betrays him. These disciples, they're just, time and again, they're just not getting it.
Just don't understand them, yeah.
Right. Yeah, it is. But of course, when we want to use the 12 as exactly the way you put it, it's for their authority. It's for the cred, the Israel cred that these numbers are mentioned, and probably even these names are mentioned. So, yeah.
With him, I mean, what about what is it, Revelation, where it says, those who overcome the tribulation, to them belong something. You know the verse. I'm just paraphrasing now, but I mean, everything shows that there was an end coming. Everything shows that the ones that were partaking in this last days story, they were the ones that had to persevere. They were the ones that had to overcome. The book of John is supposedly written to real churches who would have to overcome this, this final time. And obviously, anyone with a brain and 2 eyeballs, you don't even need 2 eyeballs, actually. You can just have no eyeballs as long as you have a brain. can see that the mother of all harlots, Jerusalem, I'm sorry, the mother of all harlots in Revelation is Old Covenant Jerusalem. There's no two ways about it. There's no ifs, ands, or big old ghetto booties. All right? It is Old Covenant Jerusalem, 150%. The mother of all harlots, the city where the Lord was slain. Where was the Lord slain? Yep, you guessed it, Jerusalem. Why was this place described as a place that was drunk off the blood of the martyrs and the prophets? Well, because if you recall, Jesus, when he came on the scene and started condemning Jerusalem, he wept over Jerusalem and said, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who have stoned the prophets and sent and killed the ones that I sent to you." Said,
so, Revelation chapter 2 is talking about churches in Ephesus, churches in Pergamum, in Revelation 3 to the church in Sardis. Back in Revelation 2, it's also talking about the church in Thyatira. Back in Revelation 3, the church in Philadelphia. I mean, Revelation 3 again, the church of Laodicea.
He's cherry picking quite a bit.
Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah.
The seven-headed beast is a reference to Rome, and is 666 a reference to Nero, or the new Nero Domitian.
Yeah, Nero's a gematria.
But there is. It's not just Jerusalem. It could be also pointing, as you point out, that there's all kinds of churches that are being addressed, and more than that, that symbolically within Revelation, there also appears to be a reference to Rome or a Roman emperor, not just Jerusalem.
Well, the early Christians used the apocalyptic message, and it was hurry up and join us before, you better join and hurry up so we can save your eternal soul. And it was used that way as a scare tactic to get people to join them, and it was a popular thing. You had a lot of violent things happening with the temple destruction, with the volcanoes. This was a pretty violent time in the Roman Empire, and you had a lot of stuff going on.
Right.
You've got a civil war to decide who the emperor is going to be in 69 when the last Julio Claudian Nero dies. You've got this apocalyptic war that Josephus says took up to 1 million lives, which by ancient standards is an apocalyptic war. You've got the eruption of Vesuvius. You've got more rebel activity. Yes, this period where the Gospels are being conceived is a very tumultuous time indeed.
Yeah, how they avoided the other messiahs and the slaughters that were taking place at the end of the first century. I mean, there was a lot going on that they had to ignore while they were trying to sell this to the Roman Empire. But make no mistake, it's a product of the Roman Empire for the Roman Empire. It was never aimed at Jews. Even only Acts says that Paul hunted early Christians down in Jerusalem. Yeah. Paul himself only says that he was hunting in the diaspora. And so if he's hunting down early Christian leaders in the diaspora, it's pretty obvious that, when they talk about the center origin of Christianity, they're talking about individual communities all across the Roman Empire. There was no one center, and it surely wasn't the Jerusalem sect that was the one center that it spread from.
Well, Paul does seem to be talking to both Hellenized Jews as well as Gentiles, and much of his audience appears to be Gentile. And if our Israel-only friends cannot read the simple language that Paul seems to be at least a good deal of Paul's audience is, and Paul go out of his way. He'll make it clear, I'm talking to my fellow Jew, and I'm talking to Gentiles. He's saying he's going to synagogues, but he's also saying that he's going out there near the Areopagus and talking to pagans. It's clear just from his language and the tradition in Acts that a main part of Paul's audience is Gentile. I don't care what Israel only thinks. It just flies.
That even goes into the division of Hellenism and Judaism. And if people don't think that there was a divide there, the Pharisees were split between Hellenism and Judaism. And half the Pharisees followed a zealot-like philosophy, and the Essenes that avoided the whole Hellenistic crowd. But there was a huge divide between Hellenism and Judaism. And you look at the school of Shammai. They were trying to set laws to outlaw it, while the other school of Hillel was trying to make it more friendly for everybody. People with money realized that that Hellenism was good for everybody, but on the same hand, they were basically oppressing them and keeping them as peasants and slaves. And an Israelite couldn't get out of that. There was no way out. The people don't understand that this was such a terrible time to live and survive, that even the rich Hellenist and Sepphoris, the bones we find had Harris lines in the bones themselves, showing malnutrition of the rich people. So that's what a terrible time this was. And so when you hear the parables of hunger and starvation, they mean it. It wasn't a joke. Your daily bread, if you got daily bread, you were probably pretty lucky. It was most people don't even realize that Passover was the only time a lot of these people ate meat. And so this was a huge drunken party. Alcohol was required, and it was the only time that people ate meat. And the Gentiles, they drove into this opulent temple, again, by the hundreds of thousands. And it's hard I've just recently been studying these numbers. I'm trying to find a more accurate way than just saying it to justify or substantiate my Gentile claim. I'm finding very little where I can say, well, 200,000 were Gentiles, 100,000 were proselytes, and another 100,000 were Hellenistic Jews that came in. You can't tell. But what we can tell that the Gentiles were absolutely welcomed into Judaism in the first century.
I believe so. There's just way too much evidence to suggest. We have a court, like you point out, the biggest part of the temple is the court of the Gentiles. There must have been a lot of Gentile interest, if nothing else, in Judaism.
Mhm.
That's just a fact.
Again, Herod didn't build that for the oppressed Jews.
No.
Or Aramaic, the peasant class. He built it the only way you could make money out of that was to bring in foreign dollars. And that's what he built it for. And that's the only reason the Romans let it stand. Most people don't understand that Pilate and Caiaphas' lives were on the line to keep peace at these events. And if Pilate didn't bring that money back to Rome with him when Passover was over, with all the haul from all the taxes and everything generated in that treasury, again, his life was on the line.
Yeah.
How I wish I could have gathered you back, but you didn't want to come, blah, blah, blah. So clearly we see that, and obviously if we're looking at this from a geographical standpoint, as in the land of Israel, dating all the way back throughout the prior generations and the prior fathers and their histories, we can see that their ancestors, their fathers were actually killed and murdered on that land, dating as far back as Cain and Abel, right? Abel was killed in the same geographical location, in my opinion, the Promised Land, and
Say what?
that's what Jesus is sort of referring to. I can't imagine that he didn't have Cain and Abel in mind, because he actually brings up Cain and Abel to the Pharisees, and he calls Cain their father. He says, your father, whatever, the verse. I'm totally paraphrasing, but fact check me on this. Jesus absolutely calls Cain the father of the satanic, adversarial, pharisaical Jews in those last days. So there is a connection. Jesus wanted you to know that Abel's blood crying out was related, okay? And it was related, I believe, geographically to that Promised Land area. And so there's a lot that can be said, but I'm getting a little off topic here. The point that I wanted to just focus on and make sure everybody understands is that Jesus makes a promise to the 12 disciples that in the age to come, in the resurrection, they would sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. My question would be, where the heck is everybody else? Right? Where are all these nations? And since we know that kingdom would be delivered back to God in the end, right? Paul says that clearly in 1 Corinthians 15. And we know that Paul ties the resurrection of all those who are Christ's to that deliverance of the kingdom back to God. So if all those who are Christ would be raised by the time of Christ's coming and that deliverance of the kingdom back to God, then clearly that makes nobody today possible to be one of Christ. It just can't work. That's just how it goes.
Where was
yeah, that shows clearly that this was actually, like Luke 1 says, the kingdom actually was the house of Israel, the house of Jacob, right? That's the kingdom. They're not sitting on 12 thrones judging 2 tribes of Israel. They're not sitting on 12 thrones judging 10 tribes of Israel. They're not sitting on 12 thrones judging the Jews and a bunch of nations. No, they're sitting on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. It's pretty simple stuff. So, folks, I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give it a like, Aruski. I hope it was satisfactory. I hope it gets your mind thinking in the right direction on a lot of these things. And we'll catch you on another episode sometime soon. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Okay, so the Pharisees are the literal descendants of, Cain? No, wait. Obviously, all of humanity is descended not from neither Cain nor Abel. They're descended from Noah, the descendant of Seth. So it's a symbolic thing, just as has been pointed out. We don't have 10 tribes of Israel anymore. They just don't exist. So it's not like there's people from the 10 other tribes wandering around someplace who could be judged at all. So
the apologetic rhetoric is so deep with this gentleman. To me, it's sad that there's people still this lost that take a literal reading and force it on others. And I think he's a well-educated. I think he means well, but to me, it's a severe lack of education and the fanaticism and fundamentalism that he's trying to sell. It's just so anti-academic. Kind of at a loss for words. It's sad to me.
It is sad. I don't think it's serious either. I don't think
I think he believes. There's a good chance he believes in it, but he's pretty crafty. He's smart. He's tried to close off a lot of the exit wounds as apologists do, but he's just so far out of academia and what is known that it's the rhetoric it's just too deep in the apologetic thinking that he's trying to present.
That's it. It's like apologetic thinking. It's not critical.
Oh, 100%. It's not academic in any way.
Yeah. I have to agree.
And he won't, and they don't live. I mean, it's trying. If you ever tried to debate a YEC, a young Earth creationist, and talk to them about evolution or science, it's the same thing. You're not going to get anywhere, and they're not going to listen, and they're just going to argue with you. And the only thing you can do is set a good example so that if somebody's watching that has half a mind, that they'll be able to make their best judgment. Exactly what Jacob, I think, is serving for us here.
I agree. I would point out to such viewers that Paul has an extensive argument about how Gentiles can be adopted into the house of Israel, and so we have to, bear in mind that the northern 10 tribes are gone, lost. They can only be being discussed here in a symbolic way, just as when Paul says Gentiles can join the house of Israel. What he's talking about there is a symbolic thing. To force it the way that Israel only is to misunderstand the language here. Language that has been pointed out, does not go back to a historical Jesus. Language that's unique to Luke. So all I can say is Israel only is lost and in the woods, and I don't see any hope for them finding any straight path out.
The problem is you've got such a high amount of apologists out there, and many are always looking for the new best thing. Selling academic historical knowledge is actually boring to these people, and they avoid it like the plague because to them it's disproving their faith, and they avoid it like the plague. It's kind of sad.
It is.
Yeah.
And even though it does seem sometimes like we are doing boring things by looking at the specific language and taking a little pick to things, that's the kind of rigorous work that needs to happen.
Well, details matter, and you can't.
Details matter.
If you can't throw them out the baby with the bathwater, you have to address them all, not just the ones you want.
Exactly.
Right.
And Israel only, oh boy, do they cherry pick. They think that the New Testament comes to a single integrated, logically consistent message, not realizing that there's various texts that say contradictory in various different things, each one with their own theological sort of perspective or agenda, and they see it as a unified whole. Then they see the entire Bible, both the Hebrew and the Christian Greek Bible, as a unified whole, as if all the prophets were consistently fulfilled with what the Gospels and Paul tell us about Jesus.
In 1 Thessalonians 2:13-16, Paul blames the Jews for the destruction, or for the wrath of God that has come upon them, and the death of Jesus, which is does not fit IO at all. And I think I'll end this recording on that note.
Okay.
Until next time.
We said it, yeah.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, and if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.